While America was being shaken by battles against monopolies and fierce political reforms, amidst that haze of smoke, there existed a war even more painful and heroic. A war without guns, without generals, without armies. Only women, those considered the weakest, rising up against an entire age-old system. And they won using their own bodies. In early 20th century America, a woman could teach. She could be a nurse. She could be a secretary. She could raise children, care for her home, and labor tirelessly from dawn till dusk. But she was not allowed to vote. She had to obey the laws, but she could not participate in making them. She paid taxes, but had no say in how that tax money was spent. She possessed intellect, education, and social responsibility, but was not recognized as a full citizen. This was the great blind spot of American democracy. Many men said, "Women are too emotional to participate in politics. What do women know about economics? Society is better when women are silent." Those words, repeated over decades, became an invisible yet solid wall, blocking every attempt at change. Nevertheless, change was smoldering. Since the mid-19th century, the generation of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had fought with petitions, with peaceful lobbying, with fiery speeches across the states. They laid the crucial groundwork, igniting the first sparks of a revolution. But after so many years, power had not budged. Society still turned its back. Congress still ignored them. It was then that a new generation emerged, a generation that was no longer willing to wait. This new generation was younger, more radical, and deeply inspired by their British sisters in arms, the militant suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst. Their motto was deeds, not words. And one of the key figures who brought this fire to America was a young Quaker woman from New Jersey named Alice Paul. Alice Paul was not your typical activist. She was quiet, almost shy, but beneath that calm exterior was a will of steel and a brilliant strategic mind. Having witnessed the brutal tactics used in Britain, women chaining themselves to railings, smashing windows, and enduring hunger strikes in prison, she knew that polite requests were no longer enough. The time for asking was over. The time for demanding had begun. Alongside her close ally, Lucy Burns, Alice Paul organized something unprecedented in American history. On March 3, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, they staged a massive suffrage parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Thousands of women marched, dressed in white with vibrant banners and elaborate floats. It was meant to be a beautiful, powerful spectacle, a living petition for the vote. But the spectacle turned into a nightmare. As the procession moved forward, a hostile crowd of onlookers, mostly men, surged into the street. They jeered, they spat, they threw lit cigars. They grabbed the women, tore their banners, and physically assaulted them. The police, instead of protecting the marchers, either stood by or joined in the harassment. One officer was even quoted as telling the women, "If my wife were where you are, I'd break her head." Over 100 women were hospitalized that day, but the violence backfired. The next day, newspapers across the country weren't just talking about Wilson's inauguration. They were filled with headlines about the brutal attack on peaceful female protesters. The public was shocked and outraged. Alice Paul's strategy had worked perfectly. The suffragettes were no longer an invisible, polite movement. They were now front-page news. They had forced the nation to pay attention. This event, the 1913 parade, was a turning point. It marked the shift from the old guard state-by-state strategy to Alice Paul's new, confrontational focus on a federal amendment to the Constitution. She formed the National Woman's Party, a single-issue organization dedicated to achieving this goal by any means necessary. Their target was clear: the man in the White House, President Woodrow Wilson. In January 1917, they began their most daring campaign yet. They became the Silent Sentinels, standing outside the White House gates day after day, in sun, rain, and snow. They held banners with pointed questions for the president, like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" At first, President Wilson was amused, tipping his hat to them as his car passed. But his amusement faded as America entered World War I. The nation was at war to make the world safe for democracy, yet half of its own citizens were denied that very right. The suffragettes' banners became more poignant, calling Wilson Kaiser Wilson and exposing the hypocrisy of his words. The public's tolerance, already thin, snapped. The women were seen as traitors, unpatriotic, and disruptive during a time of national crisis. The arrest began. Initially, the charges were minor, like obstructing traffic, but the women refused to pay the fines, arguing that they were political prisoners. So they were sentenced to jail first for a few days, then for weeks, and eventually for months. The destination was the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, a place of filth, brutality, and despair. The conditions were horrific. The food was infested with worms. The cells were cold and unsanitary. But the women's spirits were not broken. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners, and when their demands were ignored, they began a hunger strike. This is where the struggle reached its most harrowing climax. The prison authorities, desperate to break the strike, resorted to forced feeding. This was a brutal, torturous procedure. Guards would hold a woman down while a tube was forced down her throat or nose, and a mixture of raw eggs and milk was poured into her stomach. Lucy Burns, one of the leaders, was manacled to the bars of her cell. Alice Paul, held in solitary confinement in a psychiatric ward to declare her insane, endured this torture for weeks. The most infamous event was the Night of Terror. On November 14, 1917, prison superintendent ordered 40 guards to brutalize the suffragettes. They were beaten, choked, and thrown into their cells. One woman was knocked unconscious after her head was smashed against an iron bed frame. Another suffered a heart attack. The guards, in a frenzy, intended to teach the women a lesson they would never forget. But once again, the brutality backfired. News of the Night of Terror and the forced feedings was smuggled out of the prison and leaked to the press. The public, who had once condemned the protesters, was now horrified by the government's vicious response. The story of these educated, well-to-do women being tortured in prison for simply demanding the right to vote was a national scandal. The political pressure on President Wilson became immense. He could no longer ignore the issue. The courage and suffering of the silent sentinels had made the cause of suffrage impossible to dismiss. His public image as a global champion of democracy was being shattered by his own government-esque actions at home. Finally, in January 1918, Wilson announced his support for the federal suffrage amendment. He framed it as a war measure, a necessary step for national unity. It was a political calculation, but it was a victory nonetheless, a victory paid for with broken bodies and unbreakable spirits. The fight wasn't over. The amendment still had to pass through Congress and then be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The suffragettes continued to campaign tirelessly, lobbying, protesting, and keeping the pressure on. The final battle came down to a single vote in the Tennessee legislature in August 1920. A young legislator named Harry Byrne had planned to vote against it. But on the morning of the vote, he received a letter from his mother. In it, she urged him, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. Be a good boy." At the last second, moved by his mother's words, he changed his vote. With that single act, the 19th Amendment was ratified. On August 26, 1920, after decades of struggle, after parades and prisons, after hunger strikes and the Night of Terror, American women finally won the right to vote. It was a monumental victory, not just for women, but for the very idea of democracy. The story of the suffragettes is a powerful testament to the idea that change rarely comes from polite requests. It comes from demanding it. It comes from being willing to disrupt, to challenge, and to sacrifice. These women, once dismissed as emotional, hysterical, and unladylike, proved that they were strategic, resilient, and heroic. They used their bodies as their battlefield, their suffering as their weapon, and their unyielding will as their victory cry. They didn't just win the vote. They reshaped the meaning of citizenship and expanded the promise of liberty for all. Ever heard of Alice Paul? She's a name you should know, a true flame that changed an entire generation of women. Alice was born into a Quaker family where the idea of gender equality wasn't just a concept, it was a way of life. But the moment she stepped outside her family home, she saw a very different world. A world where women were not seen as equals. Driven by her desire for education, Alice traveled to England to continue her studies. This single decision became a pivotal turning point in her life, and ultimately in the history of women's rights. In London, she didn't just find books in classrooms. She found a movement. The British suffrage movement was in full swing, and these women were not asking politely anymore. They were demanding their rights. Imagine the scene in London at that time. Women were taking to the streets with a fierce new energy. They were smashing the car windows of government ministers. They were rushing into the halls of Parliament, the very seat of power. They were hanging banners from every possible perch, making their cause impossible to ignore. And for this, they faced brutal consequences. They endured beatings and arrests. Alice Paul was right there in the thick of it. She didn't just watch from the sidelines. She joined the fight. She was arrested, not once, but multiple times. She was thrown into dark, cold prison cells. When she and her fellow suffragettes went on hunger strikes to protest their unjust imprisonment, the authorities responded with a horrifying practice: force feeding. A brutal, painful procedure designed to break their spirits. Through this ordeal, through the pain and the struggle, Alice Paul learned a fundamental, unshakable truth. Democracy, she realized, isn't something that's handed to you with a smile and a handshake. It's something you have to seize. It has to be one with a resilience so fierce, so unyielding, that power itself has no choice but to bend to your will. When Alice returned to America in 1910, she wasn't the same person who had left. She carried this fire, this fighting spirit, back with her. And when she unleashed it, it ignited the American women's rights movement like a wildfire. The movement had been simmering for decades, led by women who had worked with patient determination. But Alice Paul's arrival was like a lightning strike. She didn't come back to America to continue the patient kindness of the older generation of suffragists. She respected their work, but she knew that a different approach was needed now. The time for polite requests was over. Alice Paul came back to flip the whole table over. She was here to shake the system to its core and demand, not ask for, the rights that women deserved. Her strategy was confrontational, it was dramatic, and it was absolutely revolutionary. And it would change the course of American history forever. Imagine this. March 3rd, 1913. Washington, D.C. is buzzing, not for the president's inauguration, but for something truly historic. 8,000 women dressed in pure white are about to march down Pennsylvania Avenue. This wasn't just any parade. It was a powerful statement organized by the incredible Alice Paul, who turned a seemingly impossible idea into reality. At the front, you had students on horseback and marching bands. Following them were women from every walk of life: nurses, lawyers, factory workers, all united. But as they reached the city center, chaos erupted. Hostile crowds attacked them, tearing their banners and spitting insults. The police just stood by. But did these women back down? No. They stood their ground, pushed through the mob, and kept marching, their courage shining brighter than ever. One newspaper wrote their bravery surpassed that of any battle. That day, America woke up. And for Alice Paul, this was just the beginning. So, what happens when patience runs out? After the massive 1913 parade, the women's rights movement hit a crossroads and split into two camps. On one side, you had the traditional faction. They were moderate, patient, and believed in quiet, behind-the-scenes lobbying. They'd been doing this for decades, hoping to gently persuade lawmakers. On the other side was Alice Paul's faction, and they were anything but patient. They were confrontational, relentless, and absolutely uncompromising. Alice was convinced that Congress would never give women the right to vote unless they were forced to. Waiting for politicians to have a change of heart was a losing game. So, she came up with a radical new strategy, something that had never been done before in American history. Her plan was simple, but shocking. Protest directly in front of the White House. take the fight right to the president's doorstep. And so, in January of 1917, a group of women known as the Silent Sentinels began their vigil. They stood at the gates of the White House, day after day, holding banners with powerful pointed questions. One of the most famous ones read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Think about the scene. They didn't shout slogans. They didn't chant. They committed no violence. They just stood there, in complete silence. It was a hauntingly powerful statement. Their silence was louder than any shout, a constant visible reminder to President Woodrow Wilson and the entire nation that the fight for equality was not over. They were impossible to ignore, but their timing was complicated. America had just entered World War I. Patriotism was at an all-time high, and dissent was seen as deeply un-American. Many people viewed these women protesting a wartime president as traitors. The public reaction was brutal. Angry mobs would form, attacking the women daily. People on the street would throw garbage at them, rotten fruit, anything they could find. They hurled insults, spit on them, and tried to humiliate them in every way imaginable. The police, instead of protecting them, often joined in, dragging them away from the gates and tearing down their banners. But here's the incredible part. Despite the violence, the insults, and the constant harassment, they kept coming back. If they were attacked and arrested on a Monday, a new group of women would be standing there on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, and every single day after that. They stood through blistering summer heat, through freezing rain, through snowstorms. They endured beatings. They endured arrests. They refused to back down. This went on for months. The Silent Sentinels became a permanent fixture outside the White House. Their persistence was astonishing. They were demonstrating a level of courage and commitment that was simply unshakable. And this constant, unwavering pressure started to get under President Wilson's skin. He had tried to ignore them. He had hoped they would just give up and go away. But they didn't. They were a daily embarrassment, a thorn in his side as he tried to position himself on the world stage as a champion of democracy. How could he advocate for freedom abroad while denying it to millions of women at home? The hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see, right on his front lawn. Finally, President Wilson's patience snapped. He couldn't stand the sight of them any longer. His administration decided it was time to crush the protests once and for all. He gave the order. Arrest them. Arrest every single one of them. The charge? Obstructing traffic. A flimsy excuse to silence a movement that was becoming far too powerful to ignore. But what happened next, inside the prisons, will become one of the most shocking and pivotal chapters in the entire struggle for women's suffrage. The suffragettes were arrested and dragged to the Occoquan workhouse. This wasn't just a jail. It was a place designed to break the human spirit. Imagine being thrown into a pitch-black cell, so dark you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The air was thick with the smell of damp and rot. Rats scurried in the corners and insects crawled over the walls. The women were beaten, their bodies bruised and aching. They were put on reduced rations, barely enough to keep them alive, and sometimes starved completely. Guards would force them to stand for hours on end, in the freezing cold, their limbs growing numb, the resolve tested with every shivering breath. It was a horrifying, dark, and humane place. But Alice Paul was not just any woman. When she walked into that prison, she didn't walk in as a victim. She walked in as a warrior stepping onto a battlefield. There were no tears, no pleas for mercy, no complaints. She simply met the guards' cold stares with her own, her eyes burning with an unyielding fire. They wanted her to break. She refused. After a few days of this torment, Alice Paul made a declaration that would echo through the halls of history. She began a hunger strike. One by one, the other women followed her lead. Their message was clear. You can cage our bodies, but you will never own our will. This act of defiance pushed the prison authorities to a new level of cruelty, leading to one of the most brutal chapters in the history of American prisons. What happened next is difficult to even imagine. The guards, acting on orders, decided to force-feed the women. They dragged Alice Paul into a room, her heart pounding, but her face a mask of determination. They tied her arms and legs to a chair with thick leather straps, rendering her powerless to resist. Then, they took a long, hard metal tube. They forced it up her nose or pried open her mouth and shoved it down her throat. The pain was excruciating. It tore the delicate lining of her throat, causing her to bleed. Yet, they showed no mercy. Through this tube, they poured a thin, watery gruel, a disgusting mixture meant to keep her alive against her will. They did this to her several times a day. And they didn't just do it to Alice. They did it to many of the other women on hunger strike. Each feeding was a session of state-sanctioned torture. But something incredible happened. The more their bodies were brutalized, the stronger their spirits became. The pain, the blood, the violation, it didn't break them. It forged them. It turned their will into steel. The press, hearing whispers of their incredible endurance, gave them a name that captured their spirit perfectly: the iron-jawed angels. Not a single one of them surrendered. Not one of them gave in. And it was this powerful, resilient silence, not the shouting, not the protests, but their quiet, unbreakable defiance, that finally began to shake the conscience of the entire nation. Slowly, news of the horrific treatment at the Occoquan workhouse began to leak to the outside world. Journalists wrote about the beatings, the starvation, and the force feedings. The stories spread like wildfire, and for the first time, America was forced to confront the ugly reality of what was being done to its own citizens. Every newspaper, every family gathered around the dinner table, every congressman in the halls of power had to stop and ask a fundamental question. Why? Why must these women endure such unimaginable suffering simply for demanding a right as basic as casting a ballot? It was a question that had no easy answer. These women, with their broken bones, their spilled blood, and their iron will, had done more than just protest. They had held up a mirror to the nation, forcing it to look at its own hypocrisy, its own conscience. They showed the world the price of freedom and the strength of the human spirit. And that was the moment everything changed. That was when the heavy, rusted wheels of history finally began to turn in their favor. Have you ever heard a story so powerful it changes the course of a nation? This is one of those stories. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s, and a group of brave women are fighting for the right to vote. But their fight leads them to a dark place, a workhouse in Occoquan, Virginia. The stories that began to leak out were horrifying. They were force-fed, beaten, and held in unsanitary conditions. But instead of breaking them, this cruelty lit a fire across America. Newspapers, which had once been skeptical, now ran sensational headlines. One read, "A test of the nation's values." Another screamed, "A nation questions its own principles." The story spread like wildfire, and people who had never given suffrage a second thought were suddenly paying attention. They saw the pictures, they read the reports, and they started to ask a very simple, very powerful question. In a land that calls itself free, why are we treating our own citizens this way? The public outcry was deafening. It was a tidal wave of support for these imprisoned women. They weren't just activists anymore. They had become symbols of an unjust system. Letters flooded the White House. People protested not just for the vote, but for the very soul of the country. The pressure on President Woodrow Wilson became immense, inescapable. He had tried to ignore them, to dismiss them, but now the whole country was watching his every move. He was cornered. Finally, he had no choice. President Wilson ordered the release of all the women from Occoquan. And when those gates swung open, the women who walked out were not broken victims. Oh no, they emerged as heroes. Their heads were held high, their spirit unbroken. They had faced the worst the system could throw at them and had not yielded. A reporter who was there wrote something that perfectly captured the moment. Those women emerged as if they had won a great struggle that no one else had dared to face. They had turned their suffering into a symbol of unbreakable courage, and the nation was in awe. This was the turning point. The wave of public support that had freed the women from prison didn't just fade away. It grew stronger, becoming a political force that no one in Washington could ignore. It was an avalanche. The Western states, where women already had the vote, started sending letters to Congress, demanding a constitutional amendment. They were saying, "What are you waiting for? We've been doing this for years, and our states haven't fallen apart. It's time for the whole country to catch up." And then activists took it a step further. They stood at the entrances to Congress day after day, not with angry signs, but with something far more powerful: images. They held up photographs of the women from Occoquan, showing their bruised faces and thin frames. They held up the newspaper headlines that exposed the brutal truth of their ordeal. Every single senator, every congressman who walked into that building had to look into the eyes of those women and confront what had been done in their name. The stories of hardship, of forced feedings, of women being chained to cell bars moved the entire nation. It wasn't an abstract political debate anymore. It was personal. It was emotional. People saw their sisters, their mothers, their daughters in those images. The moral weight was becoming unbearable for the opposition. Something had to give. And then the unthinkable happened. The moment that nobody, not even the most optimistic suffragists, saw coming. It was January 10th, 1918. President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had been the biggest obstacle, the man who had allowed these women to be imprisoned and tortured, stood before the United States Congress. The chamber was silent, waiting to hear him speak. He began to talk about the Great War happening in Europe. He said, "We have fought for democracy abroad." The room nodded. This was his standard rhetoric. But then he paused. He took a breath and delivered the sentence that would echo through history. "It is time now to grant democracy to the women right here at home." For a few seconds, there was absolute stunned silence. Did he just say that? The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, the man who had so stubbornly opposed the movement, had just publicly, in front of the entire Congress, declared his support for women's suffrage. He had yielded. He had bent to the will of the people. The man who saw the protests outside his window as a nuisance had finally been forced to see them as the voice of the nation. But let's be very clear about one thing. This was not a victory that was won by asking politely. It wasn't the result of quiet, patient waiting. This was a victory born from adversity. It was a victory forged in the fires of Occoquan, built on the pride of women who refused to be silenced, and secured by an absolutely unbreakable spirit. They had fought, they had suffered, and in the end, they had won. Their struggle fundamentally changed the definition of democracy in America forever. It was a testament to the fact that true change doesn't come from the top down. It rises from the ground up, fueled by the courage of ordinary people who demand to be heard. President Wilson had given his speech, but the fight was far from over. In fact, the most brutal battle was just beginning. The women's suffrage bill now faced its final test in Congress, and the opposition was more ferocious than ever. Conservative congressmen stood on the floor, their voices booming with conviction. "Women are not rational enough to vote," one declared. Another argued, "Voting is a man's responsibility, a burden we must bear for them." And then there was the classic fear-mongering. If women are allowed to vote, the very foundation of the family will crumble. But these words, meant to intimidate and silence, had the opposite effect. They were gasoline on an already raging fire. The suffragettes became more determined than ever. They became a constant presence in the halls of power. They visited every single congressman's office, refusing to be turned away. They organized a massive letter-writing campaign, flooding mailboxes with their demands. They mobilized voters back in the congressmen's home districts, applying pressure from every angle. And they told Alice Paul's story to the entire nation. They described her courage, her hunger strike, and the brutal, inhumane forced feeding she endured in prison. The story was powerful. It humanized their struggle in a way no political argument ever could. It reached the congressman who had been one of their most staunch opponents. As he heard the graphic details of the force feeding, something inside him broke. He broke down in tears right there in his office. He couldn't reconcile the image of a civilized nation with such barbarity. That day he changed his mind, and more importantly, he changed his vote. That single vote, born from a moment of profound empathy, turned out to be the decisive one. In the House of Representatives, the bill passed by the narrowest of margins. One single vote. The suffragettes erupted in celebration, but it was short-lived. The bill then moved to the Senate, and there it hit a wall of stone. The Senate, that bastion of tradition and old-world thinking, refused to pass it. The day of the vote was like a descent into hell, a crushing defeat that seemed to suck the very air out of the movement. After all the sacrifice, all the pain, they had failed. But these were not women who understood the meaning of surrender. Alice Paul, still frail and weak from her hunger strike, her body bearing the scars of the fight, refused to rest. From her recovery bed, she began to orchestrate the most ambitious campaign they had ever attempted. She called it Hang Banners Across America. The plan was simple, but audacious. They would create enormous banners and display them in the most prominent locations in every major city. Soon, the skylines of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco were draped in defiant yellow, purple, and white. Giant messages hung from buildings for all to see. Democracy must include women. Equality is too big to ignore. It was a visual spectacle, impossible to miss, a constant public shaming of the Senate. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Public opinion, which had been slowly turning, now shifted like a tidal wave. The senators were besieged. Their offices were flooded with angry letters and telegrams. Their constituents were demanding action. Their political careers were suddenly on the line. The pressure was immense, coming from all sides. The women had successfully cornered them. They no longer had a choice. On June 4, 1919, the Senate agreed to vote again. The day arrived, heavy with anticipation. The suffragettes, dressed in their finest, packed the visitors' gallery. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a sea of determined faces. They held each other's hands, their fingers intertwined in a silent pact of solidarity. Their breath caught in their throats. In front of them, draped over the railing, was their iconic banner, Votes for Women. It wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was an oath, a promise they had made to themselves and to future generations. Below them, on the Senate floor, the fate of half the country was about to be decided. Their hearts beat like war drums, a frantic rhythmic pulse that seemed to fill the cavernous chamber. Then the roll call began. The clerk's voice echoed through the hall. Aye. A wave of relief. Nay. A collective gasp. Aye. Aye. Nay. Every woman in the gallery was desperately counting, their minds racing, tracking the tally that would define their lives. Each vote was a blow or a blessing. The tension was unbearable. Finally, the last vote was cast. The clerk paused, shuffling his papers. The room fell into a silence so profound you could hear every nervous breath, every rustle of clothing. Time itself seemed to slow down. Then the clerk looked up and announced, his voice slow and heavy, "The bill has passed." For a split second, there was nothing. A void of disbelief. Had they heard correctly? Did he really say it? And then the dam broke. It began as a sob, then another, and then it swelled into an eruption of pure, unadulterated emotion. Tears streamed down their faces. Screams of joy and relief tore through the air. An avalanche of applause thundered through the Senate, shaking the very walls of the institution that had resisted them for so long. The women in the gallery fell into each other's arms, embracing, laughing, and crying all at once. Those who had endured the hunger strikes, who had felt the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs for weeks on end, wept again. But this time, they were not tears of pain or despair. They were tears of victory. One reporter, witnessing the raw emotion of the moment, scribbled in his notebook, "This is the moment America grew up." But even in this moment of supreme triumph, they knew the fight wasn't completely over. The bill had passed Congress, yes, but for it to become the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, it needed to be ratified by 36 states. The final battle still lay ahead, and it would be a fight to the finish. Imagine this. It's the summer of 1920. For decades, American women have been fighting, marching, and even going to prison for one simple, powerful idea: the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, which would grant them that right, has passed Congress. Now it needs to be ratified by 36 out of the 48 states. By August, the count is 35. Just one more state is needed. The entire nation holds its breath, and all eyes turn to one state, Tennessee. This is it, the final battleground. The state capital, Nashville, becomes an absolute war zone, but not with guns and soldiers. The weapons here are roses. The suffragettes, the women fighting for the vote, wear bright yellow roses on their lapels. Their opponents, the antis, wear red roses. The city is a vibrant, tense sea of yellow and red. The fight is everywhere, in the hotel lobbies, on the streets, and whispered in back rooms. Both sides are pouring everything they have into lobbying the state legislators, trying to win their vote. But the real war, the one that will decide the fate of millions of women, is fought inside the Tennessee State Capitol building. The air is thick with tension, so heavy you could cut it with a knife. The legislators are mostly conservative Southern men, and the smart money is on them voting no. It looks like the suffragettes' long, arduous journey might end in heartbreaking defeat, right at the final hurdle. The opposition is confident. The suffragettes are praying for a miracle. The vote begins. One by one, the names are called. The tally is neck and neck, swinging back and forth. It's an absolute nail-biter. Then it comes down to the youngest member of the legislature, a 24-year-old representative from East Tennessee named Harry T. Byrne. Everyone expects him to vote no. His constituents are against suffrage, and he's been seen wearing a red rose. The antis are already smiling, tasting victory. A no from him would likely kill the amendment for good. The chamber is silent. All eyes are on this one young man. The future of American democracy rests on his shoulders. But just before the vote, something happened that no one knew about. Harry Byrne had received a 7-page letter from his mother, Benjamin Byrne. She was a college-educated woman, a farmer, and she had been following the news closely. Tucked inside her letter, among family news and farm updates, she had written a simple but powerful instruction to her son. She wrote, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." She ended with a clear command: do the right thing. Now, back in the chamber, the clerk calls his name, Mr. Byrne. Harry stands up. He looks out at the sea of anxious faces. He thinks of the pressure from his party, from the lobbyists, from his constituents. But he also thinks of his mother's letter, tucked safely in his coat pocket. He takes a breath. And then, in a clear, steady voice, he says the one word that will echo through history: I. For a split second, there's stunned silence. Did he just say I? Then chaos erupts. The chamber explodes. The opposition, the Red Roses, are on their feet, screaming in outrage. They thought they had his vote locked. The suffragettes, the Yellow Roses, burst into tears of pure joy and relief. They start singing, hugging each other, their decades of struggle finally vindicated in this single moment. Harry Byrne, the young man with his mother's letter in his pocket, had just delivered the 36th and final state needed for ratification. The 19th Amendment was officially the law of the land. Because one man chose to listen to his mother and be a good boy, 27 million American women won the right to vote. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the biggest changes in history come down to a single act of courage. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially signed into law. The moment itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no grand parades or televised celebrations, just a simple act of a pen meeting paper. Yet, this quiet act thundered across the nation. It marked a profound new beginning for millions of American women. For the first time, they were legally recognized as full citizens, with the right to participate in the democracy they lived in. Alice Paul, one of the movement's most tenacious leaders, captured the gravity of the moment with just 3 simple words: it is done. And indeed, it was done. A journey that had spanned generations, a struggle that had begun 100 years earlier, had finally reached its destination. Think about that for a moment. 100 years. Imagine the sheer persistence, the unwavering belief required to carry a fight for that long. Women who started the movement didn't live to see its end. Their daughters and granddaughters picked up the torch. This historic achievement did more than just change a law. It fundamentally re-engineered the very fabric of American society. It opened a new chapter for women in American democracy and amplified their voices, creating echoes that would be heard across the entire planet. This wasn't just an American victory. It was a beacon of hope for women everywhere. Let's talk about the legacy of these incredible women, the suffragettes. They fought one of the most significant battles in American history, but their arsenal was unlike any other. They used no guns. They wore no armor. They had no powerful corporations or wealthy banks funding their campaign. All they had was a fearless heart, an incorruptible will, and an unshakable belief that power belongs to the people, not to a gender. Their weapons were ideas, their strategy was nonviolent resistance, and their courage was their shield. They faced down angry mobs, brutal police, and a hostile government, armed with nothing but their conviction. Their sacrifice changed America forever. It's a change we see every single day. Today, every time a woman walks into a voting booth and casts her ballot, she is walking on the path that the suffragettes paved, a path watered with their tears and stained with their blood. Every time a woman's voice rings out in the political arena, challenging injustice and shaping policy, she stands on the shoulders of these giants. Every time a woman becomes a city council member, a congresswoman, a governor, or even a vice president, she is living the future that the suffragettes died for. It's so easy to take this right for granted, to see it as just another part of modern life. But it wasn't given, it was won. It was fought for in the streets, in the courts, and in the dark, cold cells of prisons. The war they waged wasn't just to win the vote. It was a war for human dignity, for equality, for the very soul of democracy. By winning the right to vote, they tore down a barrier that had stood for centuries, and in doing so, they ushered in a new era of human rights. Their struggle became a blueprint for civil rights movements around the world. It's an epic chapter in the story of freedom, a lesson that every democratic nation must learn from. The story of the suffragettes reminds us that a small group of determined citizens, armed with nothing but truth and courage, can indeed change the world. Their legacy is not just a page in a history book. It is the living, breathing reality of the world we inhabit today. And for that, we owe them a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shaped our world.